It's now my pleasure to introduce historians Blanche Wiesen Cook and Candace Millard. Blanche Wiesen Cook is Distinguished Professor of History and Women's Studies at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She has been an important public voice for the freedom of information and appears frequently on such TV programs as Today's Show, Good Morning America, and McNeil Lehrer NewsHour. The final volume of her LA Times Book Prize winning biography of Eleanor Roosevelt examines the visionary former First Lady's most trying and influential years. The New York Times Book Review has hailed the multi-volume series as impassioned and sensitive, tender and angry, spirited and absorbing. Now, Candace Millard brought Theodore Roosevelt's near-fatal exploration of the Amazon to life in the best-selling The River of Doubt and shed light on President James A. Garfield's assassination in the much-heralded Destiny of the Republic. She is a former writer and editor of National Geographic magazine, and her work has also appeared in Time magazine, Washington Post Book World, and the New York Times Book Review. In her latest book, Hero of the Empire, The Boer War, A Daring Escape, and the Making of Winston Churchill, she chronicles Winston Churchill's extraordinary Boer War exploits. Phil Reed, the director of the Churchill War Rooms, praises, with consummate narrative skill and admirable first-hand research, Candice Millard has added to the canon of great works on Winston Churchill, a book essential to a better understanding of his life and personality. We are so pleased to have them both here with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Candice Millard and Blanche Wiesen Cook to the Free Library.
So I have to say it's such an honor to be here tonight, especially being on the same stage as Blanche Wiesen Cook. I'm a long-term admirer of her, so it's very humbling to be up here and an honor. And thank you so much for coming tonight. When most of us think of Winston Churchill, we think of this man. He is virtually a synonym for great leadership. He is a master politician, a savior of his country during World War II, winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, and one of the most famous human beings in history. But the problem with trying to understand a leader at the height of his career is that we often end up talking about the results of that person's character, not the forces that created it. What I am trying to understand is where that man came from. What gave him the courage, the insight, and the will to become such a towering figure? So tonight I'm going to talk about this man. He's 24 years old. He has just left the military, the only job he's ever had, the only job for which he's been trained. He has no money. He's already tried to run for office, but lost. He is like so many other children of privilege then and now who amount to nothing. So how do we connect this young man to the legend he later became? What made the Winston Churchill we all know? How did he become one of the most powerful and effective leaders mankind has ever produced? I believe that an important part of the answer lies in an exceptional series of events, which I describe in this book. It is a story of what happened when young Winston Churchill went to the Boer War in South Africa in 1899. Churchill didn't plan this story, and he couldn't have predicted it, but in every sense, he prepared for it. He understood its significance. He seized control of it. He risked everything to succeed in it. And he turned that opportunity into a life-changing moment that was directly responsible for his later path to power. There is a saying that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity, and that is exactly what happened here. Churchill was only in Africa for a matter of months, but what happened there put the spark to the combustible mixture of intelligence, ambition, courage, and resourcefulness that defined him from his earliest years. It transformed the young man you see here into a world-famous hero, setting him firmly on the path to power. And in doing so, it also transformed the world we live in today. Before I talk about the Boer War and the action that takes place in this book, I'd like to introduce you to young Churchill. He comes from a famous family. He's a direct descendant of the first Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill, who is considered to be one of the greatest generals in British history. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, the third son of the seventh Duke, was Chancellor of the Exchequer and leader of the House of Commons. And he was born here at Blenheim Palace, the estate that John Churchill was given by Queen Anne after he won the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. Churchill, however, would never inherit either the title or the palace. He had no income, and his father, who had died a very public and tragic death, had left him very little money. The good news was that he was naturally brilliant. He was also an exceptional writer, and he knew it. In fact, he had already written 3 books, including his first and only novel, Savrola. And he quickly discovered that he could make a living as a journalist, covering every war that he encountered. But being a journalist was never going to be enough for Winston Churchill. He was fascinated with power and consumed by dreams of glory. He had trained to be a soldier, and he loved war. In fact, even though he was only 24 years old, he had already been involved in 3 different wars on 3 different continents. And he was willing to take any risk to be noticed. He, even to the astonishment and horror of the men around him, had ridden a white pony on the battlefield in British India, just in the hope of being seen. Churchill was impatient to succeed and excel, to make his mark on the world, but no matter what he did, he couldn't get a foothold. The military was too slow for him, so he quit. He ran for his first seat in Parliament in the summer of 1899, but was rejected by voters. So, frustrated and burning with ambition, he feverishly looked for his next opportunity, knowing that it was his destiny to lead. Just 4 months later, war broke out in southern Africa. To the British, this was just another colonial war, one that they expected to be over in a matter of months, certainly by Christmas. Unfortunately, they had forgotten who they were fighting. The Boers had been living in South Africa for centuries, and in that time they had transformed from rogue splinter groups of largely Dutch, German, and Huguenot immigrants into an entirely new ethnic group, neither European nor African, but Boer. They had even developed their own language, Afrikaans, which mixes Dutch with everything from French and Portuguese to Khoikhoi. They were highly religious, unabashedly racist, and stubbornly independent. And most of all, they just wanted to be left alone. Their independence, however, had lasted only as long as their poverty. In the mid-1800s, gold and then diamonds were discovered in the Transvaal, one of the Boer republics, transforming the region from one of the poorest in the world to one of the wealthiest. Paul Kruger, who would become president of the Transvaal, predicted that this gold will cause our country to be soaked in blood, and he was right. By 1877, Britain had annexed the Transvaal, a move that quickly led to the First Boer War in 1880. Nearly 20 years later, in the fall of 1899, very little had changed. The British still wanted the Boers' land, and the Boers still insisted on their independence. The British Empire began amassing troops at the Transvaal borders, and the atmosphere, Churchill wrote, gradually but steadily became tense, charged with electricity, laden with the presage of storm. Finally, the Boers issued an ultimatum: stand down or prepare for war. The British, thrilled to have an excuse to go to war, allowed the deadline for the ultimatum to pass with little more than a sneer. Just 3 days after the war began, Winston Churchill, seeing his opportunity, was on a ship to South Africa, hired to cover the war as a correspondent. Churchill had never really followed the rules. His mother, the beautiful American socialite born Jenny Jerome, had used her influence time and again to help her son win military appointments. This is a pushing age, Churchill had explained to her. We must push with the best. Since leaving Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy, he had used every connection she had and every skill he had to promote himself. Now he was the highest paid correspondent England had ever had, and he was eager for the adventure that lay ahead. In South Africa, however, the situation had quickly begun to deteriorate. The British had seriously underestimated the Boers. Not only were they extraordinary marksmen with better weapons than the British, but they knew every nook and cranny of the South African veldt and could disappear without a trace, making them an invisible and very dangerous enemy. The British, in stark contrast, had only recently and very reluctantly begun dragging their into the modern world. Sir Redvers Buller, commander-in-chief of Her Majesty's Army in South Africa, had been nicknamed the Steamroller because the British believed that he would quickly destroy the Boers. His men, however, had only recently traded in their dashing red coats for khakis, which they bitterly complained made them look like bus drivers. And they continued to fight in perfect, precise lines, spreading themselves across the flat South African veldt like a picture in a storybook, served up for slaughter. By the time Churchill reached South Africa, the British Army had already been humiliated by the Boers, losing the first battles and leaving the British stunned and scrambling to adjust to this new kind of warfare. As soon as Churchill arrived, with his valet, of course, as well as a nice selection of wine, a light port, a French vermouth, and 18 bottles of 10-year-old Scotch whiskey, he went as fast and as far as he could toward the front, which was now Ladysmith. By the time he arrived, however, the Boers had completely shut it off. No one could get in or out. I was too late, Churchill wrote dismally. The door was shut. So he was forced to make camp just outside, just 40 miles south of Ladysmith, in a little town called Escourt. 9 days later, as a heavy rain fell in the morning of November 15th, Churchill climbed aboard the British Army's armored train. His old friend from his days in the military, Almer Halden, had been ordered to take the train out for reconnaissance. Both men knew that it was a foolish, potentially disastrous decision. Not only was the train an easy target on the best of days, but the Boers had been spotted just outside of Escourt only the day before. Halden had no choice but to go. Churchill, on the other hand, did. But frustrated, restless, and he would later admit, eager for trouble, he did not hesitate for a moment when Halden invited him to go along. Before the sun came up that morning, Churchill had climbed into the first train car, an open truck from which he would have the best vantage. Behind him, stretching down the tracks, were another armored car filled with men in their khaki uniforms and peaked helmets, the engine with its wide-mouthed black funnel and narrow tender, 2 more armored cars, and finally an ordinary, low-sided car that held tools and a few plate layers. As the train cut across the veldt, the Boers were silently and invisibly watching, led by a respected and daring young general named Louis Botha, who would later become the first Prime Minister of South Africa. Botha knew not only where the train was going, he knew that it would have to come back on the same tracks. As soon as the train passed them, he ordered his men to move to the bottom of a hill and began piling rocks on the tracks. When the train, on its way back to escort, appeared at the top of that hill, the Boers opened fire, chasing it down the steep slope until it crashed into the stones, catapulting the first 2 cars off the tracks, killing several men, horribly wounding others, and trapping them all in a hailstorm of bullets and shells. Although he was only a journalist, one of the few civilians on the train, and again, only 24 years old, we're missing one. There it is. Again, he was only 24 years old, one of the few civilians on the train. Winston Churchill took charge of the defense of the armored train, running back and forth from the engine to the first truck, shouting orders at the men in an attempt to free the train. In the end, he succeeded, and every man who made it out alive credited Churchill's resourcefulness and bravery for saving his life. Unfortunately, Churchill wasn't there to accept their gratitude or hear their praise. He had been captured and was taken to Pretoria as a prisoner of war. For Churchill, captivity was unbearable, and he would never forget how it felt. Many years later, he wrote, "You feel a sense of constant humiliation in being confined to a narrow space, fenced in by railings and wire, watched by armed men. I certainly hated every minute of my captivity more than I have ever hated any other period in my whole life." From the moment he became a prisoner, Churchill resolved to escape. Finally, with 2 other men, he had a plan. A 6.5-foot tall iron paling surrounded their prison, the Stadsmodel School, which was constantly patrolled by armed guards. When the electric lights came on at night, however, one corner of the yard remained dark. If one of the guards turned his back at just the right moment, they could make their move. After much discussion and careful planning, they chose their night. But when the time came, Churchill's co-conspirators found themselves trapped inside, in the glare of the lights and the eyes of the guards. Churchill, who had already scaled the fence, suddenly realized that he was alone, facing the prospect of crossing nearly 300 miles of enemy territory with no map, no compass, no food, no weapon, no ability to speak the language, and with the Boers, who were humiliated and enraged in hot pursuit. What Churchill did have was an absolute faith in his destiny and a clear-eyed understanding that this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. The story of Churchill's escape is an epic adventure by any standard. I won't tell you how he survived it. You'll have to read the book. But I will say that by the time it was over, Churchill was not only a free man, he rode back to Pretoria as part of a British regiment, took over the prison, released the men who had been his fellow prisoners, captured the jailers, and watched as the Boer flag was torn down and the British flag hoisted in its place. But more important than the story itself is what it meant to Churchill as a person, as a leader, and as an architect of the world we now live in. After he returned home from South Africa, he was what he had always dreamed of being, a hero of the empire. A famous man now, Churchill ran for Parliament again and this time he won. His life and British politics would never be the same. If Churchill had previously dreamed about the power of his will and his destiny, now he had proof. He was unstoppable. He had not only been part of a great adventure, he had done it alone. He would approach life and politics with an unshakable faith in his own abilities that would not only define his leadership, but provide a foundation of courage and confidence that inspired entire nations. Churchill would also carry with him the humbling lessons of this experience throughout his life. He understood better than almost any other major leader the enormous cost and tragedy of war. He was also extremely compassionate about the plight of prisoners and determined to reach out the hand of friendship to those who had so lately been his enemies. As high as Churchill rose in the political stratosphere, he would never forget his capture, his imprisonment, or his escape from the Boers. As he himself would write, "This misfortune, could I have foreseen the future, was to lay the foundations for my later life." Those foundations, in turn, would help to shape and support much of the world we know today. Of course, Churchill didn't know that at the time, but I don't think it would have come as a surprise. Thank you very much.
Whoa. It's really wonderful to be here. I'm very grateful to all of you for coming. I think it's fabulous to share this space as we look to the future with Candice, Winston Churchill, and Eleanor Roosevelt sharing a platform. And as we go forward, there are so many legacies that we have to deal with. Perhaps in a Q&A, I'll talk about Eleanor Roosevelt's feelings about Churchill and some of their disagreements over time. But I really like Candice's starting question, how did they get that way? And I'd like to start with Eleanor Roosevelt. I know some of you have read Volume 1 and 2 of Eleanor Roosevelt, and this is Volume 3, The War Years and After. And that question, how did she get to be the most beloved, the most reviled, the most controversial woman in the U.S. and in the world? And the origins of that is very much in her childhood. Eleanor Roosevelt went everywhere wanting to make things better for people in want, in need, in trouble. And she only had two things to say to almost everybody she met. It wasn't, "Let me tell you." It was, "Tell me, what do you want? What do you need?" And the origins of that is that she came from a family that was really very troubled. Her mother died when Eleanor Roosevelt was 8. Her father died of alcoholism at the age of 34 when Eleanor Roosevelt was 10. And we know now, we think of it very often, alcoholism, the family disease. Pause. How much do you have to drink to die at the age of 34? I mean, some of us are almost 80, and we drink a lot. And we're not, here we are. So the question of wanting to make it better for all people, people just like her own family, people in want, in need, in trouble. It really didn't matter that she was a child of privilege and wealth. And as Candace said, you know, you could be a child of privilege and wealth and grow up to be nobody and nothing at all. So it was really, what do you do? how do you act? What can you do? And Eleanor Roosevelt's great understanding, which she received from her mentors, Marie Souvestre at school in England, was you can't do it alone. You have to do it in community. You have to go, and ultimately in the 1920s, Eleanor Roosevelt understands you have to go with your group, with your gang, door to door, block by block, trooping for democracy. We need movements to make change. It's not going to be one lonely politician making change. And here we are. I mean, we're on the cusp of perhaps, well, gosh, only knows what we're on the cusp of. But Eleanor Roosevelt had a message: courage can be as contagious as fear. So we're looking to the future with courage, and we're looking to the future with an understanding, as Eleanor Roosevelt very often said, men hate women with power. And Eleanor Roosevelt would have specific thoughts and specific advice for Hillary Rodham Clinton at this moment. But she would also be really, really pleased that there are movements now supporting women in public life. And it's those movements that will take us to the future. Let me say a word about that. The war years and after. I'm very struck by how men hate women in power and by the activities of J. Edgar Comey. And I just want to say, Eleanor Roosevelt was really hounded and harassed and vilified and besmirched by J. Edgar Hoover. He monitored her hotel rooms. He bugged her phones. He had her followed wherever she went. And by 1923, 1924, when she worked to get the U.S. into the World Court, he began to compile an FBI file on Eleanor Roosevelt, which is one of the largest files in U.S. history. It goes on for over 4,000 pages, which I received through the Freedom of Information Act. And it is filled with what he hates the most. Well, what does he hate the most? She's a unionist. She believes workers should be protected, and they should protect each other, and that they should join unions. And then she is anti-racist. And 80% of her FBI file is what she says against segregation, against lynching, against discrimination, and for civil rights. And it's filled with his marginal notes. That fat cow is at it again. The old hen is meeting with her communist friends. Who are her communist friends in the 1940s and 50s? Everybody that opposes segregation. This is a real study as we go forward and as we stand in the 21st century, where Minister Barber has just won a North Carolina case. No, you can't disenfranchise everybody in North Carolina, yet again, in the year 2016. But the idea that you should try to do that is amazing. It really is amazing. And so I want to read a little bit from Eleanor Roosevelt, the adventurer. She said she lived her life as an adventure, But before I do that, I want to read what she might say to Hillary Rodham Clinton tonight. Because Eleanor Roosevelt was asked to run for Senate. She was asked to run for governor of New York. She was asked to run for vice president. I was very amused that she and Clare Boothe Luce became friends towards the end of Eleanor Roosevelt's life. And Clare Boothe Luce said, why don't you, the Democrats, nominate her for president? And Eleanor Roosevelt, to all these suggestions that she run for office, said, oh no, never. I would rather be chloroformed. And she would rather be chloroformed than run for office until women were ready to support other women in office. And she said, well, they're not ready yet. But she had advice. And this is what she said in 1936 to all women running for office or for positions of power in public life. You cannot take anything personally. You cannot bear grudges. You cannot get discouraged too easily. You have to take defeat over and over and pick up and go on. Be sure of your facts. Argue the other side with a friend until you have found the answer to every point which will be brought up against you. Women who are willing to be leaders must stand out and be shot at. More and more they are going to do it, and more they should do it. But remember this, every woman in public life needs to develop skin as tough as rhinoceros hide. So that's Eleanor Roosevelt's very specific words for tonight, for Hillary and for all of us. I know we don't have a lot of time, and I would like to leave some time for questions, but I want to read what Eleanor Roosevelt wrote in 1960 in a book, Learning and Living. She identified herself as an adventurer, learning and living, but they are really the same thing, aren't they? There is no experience from which you can't learn something. And the purpose of life, after all, is to live it, to taste experience to the utmost, to reach out eagerly and without fear for all new experiences. You can do that only if you have curiosity, an unquenchable spirit of adventure. The experience can have meaning only if you understand it, if you have arrived at some knowledge of yourself based on a usually painfully acquired self-discipline which teaches you to cast out fear and frees you for the fullest experience of the adventure of life. My own life has been crowded with activity and best of all with people. I have seen them wrest victory from defeat. I have seen them conquer fear and come out strong and free. I honor the human race. When it faces life head on, it can almost remake itself. In the long run, we shape our lives and we shape ourselves. The process never ends until we die, and the choices we make are ultimately our own responsibility. And that was Eleanor Roosevelt's self-recognition in a life that was very clear. She argued very early on for education for everybody, quality, free, long before Bernie Sanders said free college tuition. In 1943, Eleanor Roosevelt called for free public college education for everybody, training for everybody, full employment. and training for everybody, housing for everybody. And nobody's talking about the 30 million homeless Americans today, half of whom are veterans and their families. I mean, there are things going on today that are truly astonishing, that we all have to deal with and that we all have to consider. So imagine education for everybody, health care for everybody. And Eleanor Roosevelt was calling for what we now think of as single payer from, it was supposed to be in the 1935 Social Security Act, and the AMA lobbied it to death. It was then supposed to be in Eisenhower's 1957 Health Reinsurance Act, which gave us Medicare, and he invited Eleanor Roosevelt. Eisenhower, who had fired Eleanor Roosevelt at the UN, from the UN, asked her to come with her friend Esther Lape, L-A-P-E. There's no biography of Esther Lape. I tell my graduate students there's no biography. And Esther Lape was an amazing woman who fought for a national health care plan, single payer for everybody, from the 1920s until her death at the age of 100 in 1982. So the health care for everybody. And she said, Eleanor Roosevelt said, two things. We will not have peace until we have economic security, until we have jobs and work and dignity for everybody. That was her message. And it's a message that begins very early and continues throughout her life. In 1934, the educators of America condemned for the first time segregation, and Eleanor Roosevelt made a wonderful speech in which he concluded, we have to recognize that we will all go ahead together or we will all go down together. Let me just say that Volume 3 is the war years and after, but we're still at war. It's not even that it's after. And we have issues of race and rescue once again immediately before us. There are 65 million refugees in need of haven, in need of support, and a very big part of this book is Eleanor Roosevelt's efforts to end bigotry and segregation, to end segregation in the military, to encourage the Tuskegee Airmen, which she did. That's a very big part of this book, but also to create rescue operations and havens. There was only one. And so you see the tensions between FDR, who had to deal with a Congress dominated by Dixiecrats and isolationists, and Eleanor Roosevelt, who was very brave. She's the first lady of radio. She's gotten her own My Day column, which she writes daily from 1936 until the month before her death. It's really amazing. And she takes all these issues to the public to create movements for change, and those movements are still before us. My great hope, frankly, is that President Hillary Rodham Clinton will be faced with a movement to finally to ratify the Economic and Social Rights Covenant of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Let me pause there to say, in 1948, on 10 December 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is passed, and Eleanor Roosevelt's great diplomacy is that she persuaded the Russians not to vote against it. They didn't vote against it. And so we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Most of the world ratified both covenants. The U.S. didn't ratify the Civil and Political Rights Covenant. Does anybody, how many of you know when the U.S. ratified the Civil and Political Covenant? It's really interesting because it was ignored. As I said, Eisenhower fired Eleanor Roosevelt in 1953, and the reason why you can read my Eisenhower book. But the bottom line is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights takes a back seat. It doesn't come up again until Jimmy Carter refers to it. But Jimmy Carter doesn't bring it to the Senate. It doesn't come up again until the Soviet Union essentially collapses and George Herbert Walker Bush says now is a good time for us to ratify the Civil and Political Rights Covenant, and the U.S. ratifies it in the Senate by voice vote. So if someday somebody does an Oedipal biography of George Herbert Walker Bush and his son George Warbush, we'll see, everything his father said, no, we're not going to go to war with Iraq, so George Warbush goes to war with Iraq. His father says, we stand for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, civil and political rights, no torture, trial by jury, people innocent until proven guilty. Well, we know what happened with that. And here we are. Nobody has ever even referred to the Economic and Social Rights Covenant. In the beginning, Truman said to Eleanor Roosevelt, don't support those rights. Those are Soviet-inspired rights. Everybody has the right to a job, to education, to health, to housing. Only the Soviets care about that. And Eleanor Roosevelt said, no, you can't talk human rights to people who are hungry. If you want me to vote that way, I will resign. And Truman said, no, don't resign. Follow your conscience. And so Eleanor Roosevelt stays committed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a whole, but like her husband, she understood the power of compromise and agreed to the two covenants. 2 minutes, okay. So she agreed to the two covenants, and as I said, now it is time to go back and consider the entire Universal Declaration of Human Rights and introduce for the planet. Let me just say, one world. Eleanor Roosevelt became a great supporter of Wendell Willkie's vision. FDR, 1940, FDR says, we will have a liberal democracy or we will return to the dark ages. I submit to you that could be repeated. We will have a liberal democracy or we will return to the dark ages. Now, Wendell Willkie ran against FDR and they became friends, and FDR sent him around the world on a tour where he had an epiphany. Everything that happens anywhere affects everybody, everywhere. We are all connected, one world. And so this vision of the United Nations, which needs to be strengthened, and this vision of universal human rights for everybody is really what we need to reconsider at this moment, as poverty, inequality, neo-slavery. And let me just say a final thing in terms of this moment where we have the prison industrial complex, so much in the news and so much tragedy going on. Eleanor Roosevelt really wanted to end prisons altogether. And her vision of justice was amazing. She would visit women in prisons and say, I could have been any one of the women on the inside. I always thought maybe that meant she too could have killed her husband, but I was not sure. Bottom line, education in prisons, re-entry programs, restitution programs, restorative justice. That's what Eleanor Roosevelt stood for, and her vision, prescient and forward-looking, democratic and just. That's the future. Thank you very much.
Churchill, Eleanor, there's a great story in your book, Blanche, about how Eleanor met Churchill and they had an argument over a certain civil war. I wonder if you'd recount that.
The Spanish Civil War. Is this working?
It is working, but
you can hear
not
me?
in the hall.
Okay.
So well.
Eleanor Roosevelt supported, the Spanish revolutionaries against Franco. Churchill supported Franco. And over the years, they would argue about that all the time. He would bring it up. And she was very annoyed that he always brought it up. At one point, he actually said to her, "You don't really care much about me, do you?" And the truth is that she didn't. Part of the reason, of course, was India, and Eleanor Roosevelt was very close to Madame Pandit, and Eleanor Roosevelt really, her heart was with the suffering people of India, and always blamed Churchill for the Bengal famine. He wouldn't let troops go over the hump to provide food. 2 million people, some say more recently 7 million people perished because of that, and Eleanor Roosevelt didn't really adore Churchill. Although we're all very grateful that he got Britain to fight the Nazis. Yes.
Any questions from the audience? Yes, somebody about 8 rows back in the middle there. If you could wait for the mic. If you could wait for the mic, please. It's coming to you.
Ellen Schrecker's sister. No, who? That's somebody else. Yes. Sorry.
You talked about Eleanor Roosevelt being interested in refugees. What action did she take during the war to help get the Jews out of Germany?
Eleanor Roosevelt was responsible in large part because of Trude Lasch for the Varian Fry rescue operation. And I just want to say one of the great stories in my book is the result of a conversation I had with Trude Lasch, who was a friend, and I said to her on her deck the year before she died in Martha's Vineyard, "What's up with nobody giving you credit for the Varian Fry rescue operation?" And she banged her fist on her table, everything flew off, and she said, "Don't write that." And I said, "Well, I'm going to write it, so tell me the story." And the bottom line was Trude, her name was Gertrude von Adam Wenzel Pratt Lasch. She got her PhD from the University of Freiburg in 1931, came to the United States to teach at Hunter in 1932, went back, met Elliot Pratt, Pratt Institute. They got married in Germany in 1932. She was running an anti-Nazi newspaper. The Nazis broke into the newspaper, killed her editor, trashed her home, came to power in January. Elliot and Trude came back to the U.S. in 1933, February 1933, whereupon she becomes very important to the American Friends of German Freedom and the German underground. And she and her friends really do get it's the only rescue operation that really succeeds in 1940. It gets about 1,600 people out. This is a great tragedy and then there are other moments, but they're very brief moments. For instance, there's the SS Kwanzaa. After the SS St. Louis is sent back to Europe filled with 600 refugees, Eleanor Roosevelt says that's never going to happen again. Next time a ship is stranded in Virginia, the Kwanzaa, Eleanor Roosevelt says, "Let those people in. They will be my guests." And she has State Department allies who are making that happen, whereupon Breckinridge Long goes berserk and says, no, every issue regarding refugees is my responsibility. I am the only one who can make these decisions. And FDR agrees to that. And I want to say one of the great mysteries of this book is, why didn't FDR fire J. Edgar Hoover? And why didn't he fire Breckinridge Long? And so there's no real committee to set up rescue until 1944, when Henry Morgenthau and his people in the Treasury Department set up a rescue operation program, and Haven, with Ruth Gruber and a lot of other people who are very important to the one Haven that is set up in the U.S., is set up with Eleanor Roosevelt's participation. And so it's very little, and it's quite a terrible story. But the efforts, the vision of what could happen and what doesn't happen, I deal with in this book.
How important were the Dixiecrat segregationists to the New Deal, and how did Eleanor react to that relationship which Franklin had to have in order to pass his programs?
Well, of course, that's the most important question. I mean, the New Deal does get passed to the extent that it gets passed because of the deals made between FDR and the Dixiecrats, who dominate Congress. And so if you look at the Social Security Act, it's really interesting to see what Social Security doesn't cover in 1935. It doesn't cover agricultural workers, and it doesn't cover domestic workers, and it doesn't cover women, okay? And that's the compromise. But Eleanor Roosevelt is allied with the really wonderful movement of race radicals, black and white, who, including Virginia Durr in Alabama, there are, anti-segregationists and civil rights activists beginning to end the poll tax, early in 38, 40, and Eleanor Roosevelt works with all of them and celebrates them in her columns and in her articles and on her radio program. And that's why J. Edgar Hoover attacks her. And every one of them, including Virginia Durr, they're called communists. And so that's really a big part of the story.
Who has a question for Candace? That's where we're going
I love
next.
listening to Blanche, so we can continue with that. I'm very happy.
I enjoyed your book very much, and I just want to know, it's clear that you appreciated Churchill. Did you like him after you wrote the book?
That's a good question. I think
Repeat the question.
he asked me, he said it's clear reading the book that the impression he got was that I appreciated Churchill. Did I like him? I enjoyed spending 5 years of my life with him. I think he was brilliant and funny and audacious. But I said to my husband at one point, I don't know that I would have wanted him for my friend. I think, as we all know, Churchill was a great man, but he was far from a perfect man. He was an elitist. He was unabashedly imperialist. And there are a lot of things in a very long, very crowded life that you could argue deeply with, including some that Blanche brought up. But I think that anyone who wants to dismiss Churchill's role in World War II and in the world we live in today doesn't understand the importance and the power of words. And no one understood the English language better than Winston Churchill. And no one was able to harness that power and use it as a tool and as a very effective weapon exactly at the time when we needed it. So I found him endlessly fascinating and interesting, and I don't regret a minute of the 5 years that I spent getting to know him.
Hi, I'm Ellen Trecker's brother-in-law. So, Blanche, would you please comment on how Eleanor Roosevelt died? There's a story that she was misdiagnosed and died of tuberculosis, which at that time in 1962 could have been treated.
She was initially misdiagnosed and she was treated with steroids, and the steroids caused her tuberculosis to gallop through her body, and there are several articles in journals of medicine, which my goddaughter Elizabeth Lord Rawlins, who's a physician, made sure that I have, and I guess I didn't deal with that in my book, for which I've been criticized, and I just didn't want to get into it, and I didn't. But that is the story, and it's a tragic, a great and tragic
Thank you for
story.
being here this evening. Obviously, both of you, this isn't your first go-around with a book, and both of you have been well complimented on your work. Can you give us some insight into your daily routine in regards to your writing and your research, and how you'd spend a typical day?
So I have 3 children who are still school age, and I started writing my first book about the time I had my first child. So it's all been kind of built around them. So my typical day is I work between drop off and pick up. But I was saying earlier, it's actually been really great not having sort of all the time in the world to do it. I have an office in my husband's company, so I don't work at home, so I'm not thinking about laundry and picking up the incredibly messy house. So I drop the kids off, I go to work, I close the door, and it's like I'm in a time machine. I go back in time to whatever place and time I'm working on, and it's fantastic. I love it. It's so much fun. Every day I think, I can't believe this is my job, because most of the time, years go by and all I'm doing is reading, and I'm reading letters and diaries and newspaper accounts and books, and it's absolutely fascinating and absorbing. And then it's 2:45 and it's time to pick up the kids, and I sort of open the door and I'm very disoriented and sort of trying to step back into my own life. But sort of in a larger picture, I spend about the first year and a half doing foundational research, just traveling, gathering everything that I can. And then I spend another year to a year and a half trying to understand it, absorb it, organize it. I spend a lot of time with outlines. And I find holes in my research, and I go back and do more research. And so I'm about 3 or so years in before I start to write. And again, I'm not writing a full biography. I'm writing about a very specific moment in time that I hope is illuminating about this person and about this time. And so I can, I hope, dig in very, very deep and try to understand it as well as I can. And I hope take the reader along with me.
That's great. It's really a hard question for me to answer. Let me just say that it takes about 10 years for me to write every book. When I finished my Eisenhower book, I wrote, "I have now spent most of my vital youth with one dead general." And when I started Eleanor Roosevelt, as Joe Lash said, Eleanor Roosevelt is infinite, and she really is. I couldn't do what I do without, I say never go anywhere without your gang. I've been very fortunate to have a great support network. I teach at a wonderful place, John Jay College, where my students are veterans and police officers, and I live with my partner, Claire Koss, who is a former psychotherapist and a playwright. Imagine the luck of living with a dramaturg and somebody who really understands. And then, writers write. We do that all the time, every day, every minute that we can. I used to stay up until 4 or 5 in the morning and write and get about 4 hours sleep. After I hit a certain age, that stopped. I now go to bed earlier than 4 or 5 in the morning, which is why I'm not going to do volume 4, 5, and 6. In any case, the bottom line though, is I was very lucky to find incredible new materials that nobody had seen before, which makes Eleanor Roosevelt even more infinite. For about 10 years, I worked for the State Department Historical Advisory Office, where we were declassifying documents that were State Department, international documents. And I said to my boss, Bill Slaney, look at all this stuff you send me before every meeting, boxes of material. This is what we're going to talk about. This is what I want you to think about. And I said, what do you think Eleanor Roosevelt's papers might look like from you people? For the very long period, she was a State Department employee at the United Nations, 1946 to 1953. He said, let's go look for it. And we did. We went to the National Archives and we found 198 boxes. And so I didn't use all that material. It's filled with wonderful things. We declassified it on the spot. We both had top secret security clearance. We just declassified it. So it's there to be used. It's really thrilling. And then true to Lash's children deposited 10 boxes of papers after her death on our doorstep. And they said Truda didn't want Joe to use this material, over to you. And it's filled with magnificent things to know about. But the bottom line is someone has to write a biography of Truda Lash. That'll be a great story. So, it's a process. Like revolution is a process and not an event. A book is a process and not an event.
We'll see you back here for the bio of Truda Lash. Please join me in thanking Blanche Wiesen Cook and Candace Millard.